Welcome to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director of the Writer Center, and mainly that means I get to do cool things like this, which is talk to amazing authors who connect to the Writer Center in some way. And this time, we're really excited that we have Steve Majors with us today, who is not just an amazing writer, but also one from the region that we're in. So we're having a little local flavor, which which is always really great, especially when you do virtual events, supporting some people from our region and our local city and the surrounding area. So Steve, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. To get started, I believe you have a copy of your book handy. And I was wondering if you could just read a brief excerpt, just enough to give the people here a taste of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the evening.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Zach. And thank you to the Writer Center for inviting me to participate. The kids on the school playground weren't the only ones who questioned where my light, bright complexion came from. So did my first friend in life, my cousin Kathleen. Only 6 months in age and a few yards of crabgrass separated me and Aunt Bonnie's daughter. So from the time we were toddlers, we were inseparable. The grown-ups said where you saw one of us, you saw the other. And they took to calling us Salt and Pepper. They thought it was funny, and so did Kathleen and I, until it occurred to both of us one day that our nickname didn't just mean we naturally went together. We'd already started comparing ourselves, our height, our speed, what made me a boy and her a girl. Well, now we began to place our hands and arms side by side to see the differences that everyone else apparently saw. Maybe you just need a suntan, Kathleen offered as she poked at my freckled skin. Yeah, maybe, I said, but neither of us was really convinced. Although I was looking for an explanation, there was another part of me that was afraid someone would tell me that I might not really belong. My raucous and raw-talking family confused and scared me. But they were all I had in the world, and as a little boy, I still needed assurance I had a place among them. I'd learned the hard way not to ask them questions. So I kept my doubts about who I was to myself. The exception was Kathleen. Together, we'd come to understand that we lived in an extended family where bad things happened and where everyone kept those things secret. It was comforting to know Kathleen and I at least had each other to share our own secrets and sorrows. Our shared experiences of growing up in those circumstances also meant we understood each other all too well. While it was true that only Kathleen knew exactly what to say to make me laugh until my belly ached, it was also a fact that her words could just as easily bring me to bitter tears. That happened one day when we were playing our favorite game of pretend outside. We like to role play rich people, you know, the families who ate out at McDonald's or shopped at JCPenney's. I can't remember why we argued, but Kathleen demanded she have the last word. Shut up, she said, putting her hands on her hips like the grown folks did. Although we were the same age, Kathleen stood about an inch taller than me. I was determined not to be bossed around. Make me, I said. Kathleen shoved me hard until I fell on the ground. When she saw me trying to stand up, she shoved me back down and spit on me. How you like that, huh? Now go on and cry with your dumb self. You think I care? Run home to your mother with your stupid, funky, white ass. Her words hurt more than any physical blows could, because in that moment, Kathleen had uttered a secret curse. She didn't say I just needed a suntan or claim that I was just black, like most of my family. She didn't take delight in being a part of Salt and Pepper. Instead, she called me something that no one else had, a word she knew would hurt and confuse me. She called me white. And that meant all the terrible things I thought about myself, things nobody would ever admit, were probably true.
Thank you. And everyone, that was a reading from Yella, Steve's brand new amazing memoir. So please get a copy of this and support his writing and through your local independent bookseller if you're able. Just in your own words, to introduce yourself to everyone, who are you?
Yeah, well, I am the son. I'm the youngest son in a family of five. And I think, because I've got my thing on. You'll see me, I'm the youngest here. of 5 kids, and I looked remarkably different from my siblings, whose skin tone, demonstrated that they were Black, but I was told that I was Black, and yet I looked different and did not understand why. So I'm the youngest son of a family of 5, and I'm also a parent. I'm a gay parent, and I'm an adoptive parent of 2 kids in a transracial family. My husband is Jewish. Both he and I obviously are white appearing, and our daughters are Black. And so I often describe myself as, in some cases, someone who sort of sticks out in my family, whether it was the family I was born into or the family that I created.
Great, thank you. So turning to talking about the craft of writing, the first question we like to ask is sometimes the hardest. So let's get out of the way. Is what's a question you really wish someone would ask you about your writing or your writing practice? What haven't you gotten to speak about before that you might like to start off this event talking about?
Sure. I think the question that I would hope someone would ask me is why, what was it, what did you hope to accomplish by writing this book? Because those who would pick it up would probably say, this is a very raw and revealing look into your life. And what did you hope to achieve by it? And I think the answer would be, I think what I set out to do is I achieved, but what came after it was something that was completely unexpected. I think I set out to write this book to make meaning for myself about events in my life, my childhood, and my present day experience. But what I discovered in this journey was so much deeper and richer, that as much as it was about me making meaning out of my life, my family, I found as they read it, I think they were able to make meaning out of our existence as a family. And so that's not a question that I've been asked, but one I've been interested in talking about. And then as a writer, Zach, I think the question in terms of the craft of writing, it would be, what is your favorite genre? Or I assume it's nonfiction, or have you written other genres? And the answer is, I wrote a lot of nonfiction. I was a television news writer for many years. So I had a very journalistic style. And what I learned along the way, again, is that there's a craft to writing a book. You may be a great writer, but that does not mean that you can author a book. And fortunately, I had great teachers along the way. I had great examples and models along the way, and things that I picked up on my own that allowed me to publish this book.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the TV career there. I also, my first job was in television. I was on the post-production side, primarily commercial production. So I wasn't doing the news writing side, but I worked as a producer too. So not quite as much writing in that job, but I'm always interested when I get to talk with a writer who didn't necessarily start out as a writer in the sense of writing books, who's had other things go on in their lives, because I think it's really interesting how pretty much everything in life becomes writing once you become a writer. All those experiences inform how you function as a writer. So I like to, whenever I have the chance, I like to talk about this topic. So has writing outside of maybe the writing you did in the job, has that always been part of your life, even when you might have been focused on other things? Were you jotting in journals? Were you jotting down story ideas or anything like that? Or is writing something you came to just for this project or a little bit later?
No, it wasn't. I always fashioned myself a writer. I think as a kid, I was like, oh, I'm going to be a writer, I'll write a book. But I did not do a lot of creative writing. I did creative writing in school for projects. I enjoyed it. I liked it. But I think I got onto a path very early on, straight out of college, where I was writing as part of my job. So I think I developed, there were some great skills. I can write very quickly. I can edit, those sorts of things. And I think it was only that I really began to really think about creative writing in when I started doing sort of journaling for myself and writing stories about my own experience, primarily for myself. I was an audience of one. And I think the change came about when I decided to write a blog and post a blog for work that had a personal anecdote in it. And so it was, there was a story embedded in it. And for me, it made it that much more meaningful and impactful. And I had some positive feedback about that. And that led me down a path, I think, of, writing from personal experience to whatever I was writing about to make it more impactful. And that's really sort of the path that really led me to sort of writing just for myself and about my personal experiences.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the ability to edit and to write fast as a couple of particular skills you got, but I'm wondering too, what maybe non-writing skills, things that weren't writing in your previous jobs, did you find were useful for working as a writer? For example, I edited about 1,000 really terrible local television commercials in my tenure as a post-production person in TV, and they were terrible. But also, I mean, I can look quickly at a piece of visual information, find the stuff I need into it, and put it into. So my sense of visual continuity and visual flow is probably stronger than someone who didn't have that job. So things in that kind of idea, like what are some other things you did that maybe you found yourself, what do you think maybe you're good at that other people aren't good at because you weren't a writer the whole time, because you had this other stuff in your back pocket?
Sure. I think characterization, story arc. Even in writing for television news, I mean, there were times that I was writing or consuming or editing that longer form stories that weren't just about a car accident, and that had a beginning, middle, and end, and you had to identify a character. You were thinking in terms of protagonist, antagonist, thinking about tension in the story. I think that was one thing. I think just characterization and maybe dialogue. I don't think I'm great at dialogue. I think I'm okay, pretty good at dialogue. And I think those are the things that I picked up along the way in my professional experience that I was able to bring to the craft of writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yes, you're good at dialogue. Just accept it. You're good at dialogue. You can claim that. That said, though, I mean, you have a family life. You still have a job. You're still doing all these things. How do you fit writing time into what seems like a very full life? Where does your writing time come from?
Yeah. So I would like to say again, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, that I am not part of the 5 a.m. club. I don't get up and write every day. I'm ashamed to admit it because I'm almost afraid to does that not make me a writer, right? Having said that, I over the last couple of years, I've also done a lot of essay writing, and so I've published in, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Boston Globe, and so there was a regular sort of cadence of me writing. But having said that, how did I write this book? It was very intentional. I remember I took a 6-week sabbatical off of work after I had outlined, after I knew I had the raw material. Some of it were journal entries, others were sort of stories I had posted on my blog or posted elsewhere. And I created a narrative outline, and I sat down and I got up every day for 6 weeks and I wrote nonstop. And I set myself a goal. I was like, I'm going to write a chapter a day. Many times I was able to do that. Some days I was able to get 2 chapters, sometimes a little bit less. But it was the goal that really propelled me forward, that I had to get this finished, or I had to get something on paper, a good part of it, because once I came back to work, I wasn't going to be able to do that. Now, having said that, once I came back to work, on my lunch hour, I was downstairs, in the coffee shop, writing and editing and revising. On weekends, I was doing it. And for me, so that's been sort of my writing practice. I have a second, and maybe we'll get into it. So I have a second book, a book of young adult fiction that I wrote. And for me, I wrote that because when I was waiting for this to be published, I was like, my head was so what's going to happen next? When is it going to be published? What am I going to get the galleys? What do I do? I needed something to occupy my mind and not obsess over this book. And so I set aside a period of time, and I wrote that second book. Now that second book is currently, being on submission. And I'm like, what's going to happen with it? How come nobody's picking it up? And so I actually have a third book in mind, and I'm going to set aside time and just write that.
Mhm. That's a good, I like your process. I like that I think it's important to point out that the 5 a.m. club isn't a requirement, that there's lots of writers of this day who swear as if it's etched in stone fact that you have to write every day to be a writer. Fortunately, there are now more and more writers coming out and admitting like, not so much. And I do it in spurts, or I do it 3 days a week, or I fit it in lunch breaks. It's always good to repeat that there's a lot of ways to be a writer, and there's no single way that counts more than another way.
Yeah.
We already have a number of questions coming in the chat, so I'm going to look that way for right now. First question: book writers start their books at different places. Some start in the middle and work towards each end. Some start at the beginning and write totally toward the end. How did you write this book?
Yeah, this particular book, like I felt like I needed to have an outline, and I think each of the book, like the second book that I wrote, or the second manuscript that I wrote, an outline. And in this third one, I feel like the need to have an outline. Like, do I know generally where I'm headed? And the chapters will come naturally, or I'll have to go back and say, I'm missing something here in the narrative. Like people are not going to be able to follow this through line. So I am a big believer in outlines. Having said that, my outlines are, they're like synopses of very small, sometimes a sentence, because I had it in my head, like, I'm going to write this chapter about that. I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Someone just asked, will this be recorded and posted? Yes, we will post the recording hopefully as soon as tomorrow on the website and on YouTube. When you were blogging, did you ever feel fearful of people knowing that your writing was personal to you, or did you not care? If you were fearful, how did you overcome it?
Sure. I think it was the latter. I didn't care. I think that, again, because I had in mind what I was going to write, if there was anything that I thought was going to cause me anxiety about sort of being something personal, I would just not put it out there. And so I never had regrets about anything that I wrote or put out there. I was like, I'm just going to be completely honest. My spouse, he's been a great supporter of my writing. There have been times, and anything I put out, I'm like, read this. Are you going to be okay? Because I do not want you yelling at me about this 2 weeks from now or a month later. Same with this book. And I'm like, I just want to know now if you're going to be okay. And so I've never put anything out there and with the fear that I might have to pull it back.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So another question from the chat: what advice can you give someone writing a memoir? How much should be stories, and how much should be one's views about those stories?
Yeah, I think it's I think the question, I would sort of I would say back that both are true, right? Now, how many are stories, right? Even the process of you writing a story means that you have filtered it through your memory and your perspective and your view of what happened. So in fact, that is memoir, right? It is a retelling, a recounting of historical, events through your perspective, through your meaning making, okay? And how many stories you tell, again, that's really up to you as a writer. How you frame them, that's really up to you in the creative process. And so I would say, I have always, one of my biggest things that I discovered in the process, story determines structure. Like I wrote, and that told me so much about and I learned a lot about the structure. Not as much show here, more tell here. I need an emotional respite here. It's feeling really heavy. How do I pull back? Whose perspective is this from? It told me about point of view. I mean, everything. So story will determine sort of some of the structural questions that you might have in writing memoir.
I might add too that in general, and there's certainly no universal concrete advice on this, readers generally don't want to be told what to think. They want to be presented the information in such a way that they can interpret the information. So if you're getting to the point where you're explaining what they should think or feel about the story, and if the story, I think in general, we like writing where the story, at the end of that story, without being told, we're all going to still feel sort of the same thing because the story was well told. The story itself leads a reader to the conclusion that you would want them to, without you having to say it's the show don't tell thing a little bit, but more on a thematic and subject level rather than like a small scale.
Exactly.
And just in terms of publishability, that style of writing is more publishable. So if you're carrying it, whether or not it's better or worse than anything else, that's what agents and editors expect, is writing that functions in that way. So a little bit of practical, sadly, I hate to talk practical about art, but sometimes you have to if you're in the publishing industry. So
that's true.
Back to the chat window. What do you think makes a good writer? How do you make your voice unique? It's a tough one.
I think it's all about sort of I think what makes a writer unique. One of the best pieces of advice I got was about having an audience in mind, like having one person that you know that you are writing this book for. Somebody who you know, like, if I write this book for this one person, hopefully someone that you know very well, that will tell you so much about how you want them to receive the content, like what you want them to feel, what you want them to think afterwards. So that was a great sort of piece of advice for me. So in this book, I always kept my sister in mind. She was sort of that imaginary reader, not just because she was my sister, because she has a certain personality, a way of looking at the world. And so in terms of like what makes you a great writer, perhaps it's your ability to know, right? To have an audience in mind that you know would welcome the content that you're putting out in the world and writing for them. And in terms of a voice, that's difficult, right? It's a very subjective thing. I think when this book was out on submission, there were editors like, well, I can't connect with the voice, right? Even on the second manuscript, there are folks, the feedback that I've gotten is like, love the story, can't connect with the voice. Voice is very subjective. It's who you are, right? It is your identity. It is, I think of my voice of, if I am telling a story, right, and trying to convey a feeling and emotion, there are things I'm bringing to my storytelling, like whether it's it's a way of looking at the world, right, in which I'm trying to convince somebody of a point of view or convince them to agree with my point of view. And so that voice is you have to know yourself, right? What are my strong opinions about the things that I'm writing about? To me, that is your voice. And if you're able to convey your opinion in a very compelling and unique and distinct way, that is your voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. Back to the chat window again. What have been your takeaways, if any, from the response to your book from white people who might not have been aware of colorism and its history in the Black community? Yeah,
I think if anything has been surprising, I think that, some folks have said, I'm so sorry that you went through this. And I didn't, and a few people have done that. And I didn't want that to be the reaction of people, to read what I wrote and to feel like this was, a story of family trauma that was meant to sort of evoke sympathy for me or me as a child. I'm very clear-eyed and very objective about the things that went on in my life, and I've dealt with them for the most part. And this was not a way of me settling scores. This was not for me, again, to evoke sympathy for things that happened to me. So that's probably been what's most surprising in some reaction about it. And I think part of the question was also about sort of color and colorism. Again, that there are some readers out there that are not aware of how pervasive that phenomenon exists, including in the Black community. And so I think, when I happen upon these folks, I'm like, oh yeah, you need to read more or expand your circle of, like, learn more about this phenomenon, because it's very real for a lot of people.
Great. So back to the chat, you said earlier that your interest in creative writing started with journaling. Did you have a bunch of stories and then notice through lines between different memories? How did you organize your book in terms of, I guess, that journaling? Was that an organizing principle at all and how the book came together?
Yeah. In fact, that is how I came upon the content. As I was journaling and I had these stories, I was able to sort of, people have always asked, like, why did you write? And I say, primarily, I did write to make meaning for me. And I think all writers, right? Even if they're writing fiction, I think they do it to make meaning for themselves about anything. And especially if you're writing memoir, it's about making meaning. And so as I was looking at those journal entries and some of the public blogs, I began to notice themes and patterns. And I was like, wow, this really, I uncovered something here about my experience here. And I see that I wrote about it over here and that there is a link here. And so as I sat down to write the book, I had some content, some existing content that was about my childhood experience. I had some existing content that was about my present day experience. And I had other things rolling around in my head that fell into both of those buckets. And I knew I wanted to be able to make connections between how the past was affecting the present, how the present was making me rethink the past. And so folks who pick up the book will notice that it's not told in a traditional chronological order. It's a parallel structure in which the chapters are organized along themes. They're roughly told in, if you take them discretely, they're told in chronological order, but as they're organized in the book, they weave back and forth. And so the thematic connection between the past and present is where I'm explicitly trying to draw parallels for the reader.
So was it ever a chronological book, or was it ever in draft? Or sections of it ever chronological, and then you realized they should be put back together, or was this always an interwoven parallel storytelling?
No, it was very, very early on. But what I was finding is some of the earlier chapters, like, just had so much emotional weight and were heavy and darker. And I felt like there was not enough attention and weight given to sort of the present day chapters. And I found that it was hard as a reader myself. I was trying to objectively take myself out and draw those parallels myself because they were there. I could see them. And I felt like I really had to make that explicit for the reader to draw those parallels. And I wasn't trying to sort of pander to them, but it's some of the content is very complex and there are multiple themes running through it. And so I wanted to help the reader along and not make them do more work than they needed to do. And I will tell you, I had an agent early on. I now have a different agent who, when we were going out in submission very early on, she's like, I don't know, I think you should just go back and write this in chronological order. And I was like, absolutely not. I can't. I really just cannot. And for that reason, I actually separated from that agent and have my current agent because I so firmly believed in that structure. And I'll tell you, back to this, Zach, I think what's interesting to me is that idea of a parallel structure. I mean, you find it in literature, right? It happens. Maybe not so often in memoir, but you see it a lot in different art forms, movies and television, right? The flashback, flash forward, the flashback, flash forward, right? And I'd like to think that is something that I probably brought from my television storytelling days, that parallel structure.
I mean, it's really, really well done. I mean, that's one of the, I think, best accomplishments in the book is how the parallel structure reinforces both storylines back and forth. So, I mean, it's one continuous storyline.
It was hard though.
I'm
It was
sure.
very hard. Somewhere out there, unfortunately, in a recycling bin or a landfill are a bunch of huge poster boards with markers and post-it notes and lines. Yeah, it was
And
difficult.
I think maybe a really important thing that wasn't maybe the lesson you meant to do there is that agents aren't always right. Editors aren't always right. They're people with opinions and they have power. They're the gatekeepers of the thing you're really trying to accomplish if you're a writer, but it doesn't mean they're have the right. They maybe have even if they have the best interest in mind for you, they may not still be right. They can still be very wrong in a particular project. So they are also people with tastes and interests and sometimes with bad ideas. So,
and sometimes good ideas. And you have to be willing to take the ones that you're like, yes, that makes sense. And this one was one I was like, I just don't feel it.
Yeah. And that relationship should be a positive collaborative one. It should never feel like you're being pressured to do something that you're totally against. So you mentioned one thing just a couple questions ago. You mentioned the idea of making meaning as what the writing act is, whatever writing. And I thought too, there's something I always think about too, which is it's an interpretive act. It's whether I'm writing a nonfiction piece or a piece of fiction, there's something I'm interested in, and the writing process is how I'm interpreting it and figuring it out on the page. And then when someone enjoys what I write, it's because my interpretive act either aligned with some predilection they have for a similar type of interpretation, or introduces them, maybe ideally, I think would be introducing them to a new type of interpretation to the ideas and the thoughts on the page that maybe they can adopt from you. But anyway, I just was thinking about that as you're talking. And I like thinking about writing that way, that it's not about the finished product, it's about the act. The act is where the magic occurs.
Exactly. Yes.
Back to the chat window. How did you handle the emotion of your family reading your book and their appearance in it?
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate or unfortunate enough, like a number of the people that I wrote about from my childhood have since passed on. And so I was able to sort of know, right, that I'd hoped that I, was portrayed them authentically and treated them fairly and with dignity, even if I had to write things that may not have been positive about them. I had to believe that I handled them even-handedly. For those family members, there were a few from my childhood who are still around. A couple of them, my brother and my sister who has since passed, read the book and I got their approval. The only person, and my husband, my spouse, and my kids read the book or portions of the book, and they were like, okay, like, yes, that's true. We stand behind that. The only person, honestly, that I was concerned about was my aunt, who plays, it's probably one of the most interesting characters in the book. And probably very early on does not come out very positively. I would like to think by the end, there's redemption. And I will admit that I didn't tell her about the book. And as the day approached for publication, I'm like, maybe she'll never know, because I have a relationship with her, but I'm like, I just can't face her. She found out about the book and I called her. I said, before you call me up and cuss me out, read the book in its entirety and then let's talk. And she did that. And she came back to me and she said, it was tough for me to read some of the things you wrote about me, but what I appreciate how I am making meaning is that this is your remembrance of me, your perspective of me as a child, your interpretation of what happened as a child. And she could live with that. And we have a good relationship. And so that allowed me to kind of get over that fear of that one family member.
So I think that leads to the next question in the chat pretty well, which is, when you were writing your memoir, were there moments where you would pull back so as not to relive trauma as a personal trigger? How were you able to share difficult moments without losing yourself in them? And did you find this to be a healing process for yourself and others?
That is a great question, and one I have not received and one I welcome. It was very triggering for me, and I was not even realizing it as I was writing it. And I can remember looking back, and I would write and or even in the revision process. And I had no idea what effect it was having on me. My husband was telling me, my kids were telling me, I was short-tempered, I was distracted, I was irritable, I was so many things. And so I had never taken that into account. I thought, I've dealt with these issues in my life, and so I'm able to objectively write about them. Ultimately, it was a healing process for me. I'm a stronger person. Um, I've dealt with these issues. I know them. I feel good about them because there were so many things that were sort of I had treated as shameful or secret. And I think the process eventually of me processing those and putting them out in the world and writing about them, it was ultimately a healing thing for me. And so I recommend anyone who is writing in that way to think about, like, writing a book is not therapy, and it should not be treated as therapy. Go find a therapist or figure out what to do for yourself, right? If you're writing about trauma. So don't use it in that respect, and figure out a way to build in self-care and to step back or pull back at times when you need to create a distance from what you're writing about.
That's great advice. You mentioned that your sister represented your target audience in a sense. Who would you say this book is for? What are some things you hope readers take away from the book?
Yeah, I would hope everyone is a target audience because, ultimately it's about issues of race, class, identity, family trauma, right? So many different themes run through the book. And those are common themes that we're all dealing with in different ways. Now, we all aren't growing up in trauma, but, or we all might not be in families, dealing with intergenerational poverty. We all might not be in families that are dealing with issues of race and class, but we deal with these issues in so many different ways. I guarantee you that if I picked one theme in here, it's something that somebody has grappled with in their life at some time, in a relationship, in a workspace. And so these themes, even, I would say, ultimately, even a reader who has the most distance from some of those issues, one of the themes that I hope that comes through is about the resilience and the strength of family. And family is an imperfect body, but family can be resilient, can be something that is a powerful force in your life. And I'd like to think again that anyone with a family would be an audience for this book.
All right. In the chat, I think I'm going to skip over one question. I think we sort of addressed it already. So the next question I'm going to ask from the chat is, as an educator, what advice can you offer that might help educators demonstrate to students the importance of writing, especially with all the competing screens?
Yeah, I think it's something I deal with my own children, right? It's, I'm trying to, I'm like, if they're struggling in creative arts or in writing, what I tried, like, the best advice would be getting kids to write about things that they love, and trying as best as you can, as you're encouraging them in the writing process, to not worry about it being perfect, to not at the outset worry about the grammar rules and things like that, but get them in the love of writing and reading, right? All good, I'd like to think all good writers are good readers as well. And ultimately, it's about storytelling. Who does not love a story, right? And if we can get our kids to understand, that writing is a powerful tool for them to tell stories that are meaningful to them about anything that they want, that is a way, I think, to really get them interested in the craft of writing.
Hard agree. And follow a quick second part of that question is, do you draft with pen and paper or on a laptop?
Yeah, great question. I outline on paper and I write on a laptop. And early on, I think like, and I think that's only because of my television news career. Like for so many years, like everything literally, was written into a computer. So I've learned to kind of organize my thoughts that way, seeing it in that way, but I cannot outline electronically. I have to do it on paper.
I have a notebook that I write some stuff in. I don't ever write drafts of anything, but notes and ideas and snippets. So each big project has its own little notebook and little doodles and stuff all throughout it. But then when it's time to write stuff, it's always straight into the laptop. Though I know lots of people who do freehand and live by it. So try both ways.
Yeah, whatever works for you.
Try writing only on gum wrappers. Who knows? Maybe you'll discover. A practical business side of book publishing question: how are you marketing your book? Is it selling well, and what advice would what would you advise others to do in marketing a memoir?
Yeah, I have a lot to tell and learn about that. I have no idea how well it's selling, and that is not the bar that I ever set for myself. Right? I was like, I want to publish a book and put it out in the world, and maybe a couple of people will say good things about it. And I have never. I don't know. My publisher has said like in another quarter they'll give me sales results. I don't care. I really don't. So I did not go into it for that. Like I want people to read it. If they pick it up at a library, if they buy it, like if they share a book, like sales mean nothing to me. In terms of the marketing, like I come from a marketing background, but book marketing is a very specific science. And I had to learn what that meant. And even if you're working with a large sort of traditional publishing house or a small indie or academic press, I would strongly suggest that you learn like what the marketing process is like and what it entails, and figure out where you can lean in the most, what you can bring. You cannot leave it in the hands of your publisher to do everything and to do everything well. And there's a lot of work that you have to do in terms of building your own platform and following, your ability to kind of enlist blurbers and enlist folks who will be champions of your book. And in terms of me marketing, there were a couple things that I just took on my own once I learned how to do. Like I found my blurbers. I'm like, who are the folks that I think are going to, endorse my book, who I believe in and who have a bit of a platform, and I can use and make sure that they were distinct, that they had distinct followings and audiences, right? So that I knew that I would reach those folks. I set up my own website. I started building my own social media sort of presence. I did that. Like I created a newsletter. But I also hired a publicist though, to pitch media stories and to pitch events, because I didn't have the contacts and I didn't have the time, and they had both. And so there were things the biggest takeaway I think for anyone is learn what book marketing entails and understand that you are going to have skin in the game. You're going to have to contribute in some way.
Yeah. I'd add too that there's so much work that authors have to do, but the author does rely to some degree on the publisher or a publicist of some sort, because the scope of marketing a book nationally is beyond an individual. And publishers or publicists have mechanisms in place that take care. Something that would take you as an individual, weeks of research and learning and effort full time. These people already have that in place and can. So sometimes publishers like try to blame authors for poor sales, and that's never the case when there's poor sales. It's always the publisher's fault. Always the publisher's fault. But you as an individual can help. Absolutely. And the more you know about it, the less confusing it is when you're going through all these processes. And even if you're just doing what the publicist from your publishing house tells you, you might understand then why they're asking you to do that thing. And it helps make the work go a little bit easier if you know what the heck's going on.
Yeah.
Do you have a book signing scheduled anywhere?
I don't, primarily because, again, so many of the events this year have been virtual. When my publisher did a launch event, they were able to offer that as sort of a premium, but unfortunately for the time being, probably not.
Yeah. This is an interesting question from the chat. As a writer, how did you start to differentiate between what was a more personal piece of writing versus something that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I think it was very simple. Like I would use the lens like this regret, right? If I put this out in the world, will I have personal regrets or am I harming anyone? I think the thing that I was most concerned about were my children, right? Who were sort of preteen when I started to write this and are now teenagers. And the lens that I put for them is 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if they read this book or read something about themselves, will I be causing them harm? So it was really, will I feel emotional harm or real harm to me from what I'm putting out in the world, or will I be harming somebody else? And that became my litmus test of what might be too personal or not.
Mm-hmm. Great. How many drafts did you go through when the book was, how many drafts did you go through when the book was completed? Did you toss everything in your files except the final version of the manuscript?
Yeah. It's hard for me to count. It's hard. Like, I would like to tell you that I was organized enough to say I went through 30 drafts. I will tell you, for I think any good writer, like the first draft of the book, like, yeah, you'll probably like it 50% is different from what is in the published manuscript. Maybe not in substance, but in structure and just different organization, really different. And so don't psych yourself out by feeling that like your first draft is, just know that it's going to go through many iterations if before your book is published. And that's okay. And just believe that you are making it the best possible book through that redrafting process. So try not to psych yourself out about how many drafts it has to go through. The final draft is the one that's right. And in terms of, I did, just for organization, I think I kept a couple of later drafts for me. There wasn't substantial pieces of the book that I had left on the cutting room floor that I wanted to go back to later. And ultimately for me, it was an organizational thing. Am I able to put my hands on the final draft and maybe one or two before if I ever wanted it?
I'm brutal. I use one document and delete stuff and never worry about it after that. Like if I make the change, it's gone. I guess somewhere I can find the old draft if I need to, but I've never actually gone back and done it. So I'm usually pretty confident and brutal when it comes to editing. So old stuff doesn't get saved. Another question from the chat on the book business side of things. Can you recommend a resource for learning the process of book marketing?
Internet. Really. I mean, it's all out there.
Yeah.
It's all out there.
Yeah. Google, use your best judgment. If something seems off, don't trust it on the internet, but there's a lot of resources. And there's a book, it's not purely on the process of book marketing, but it's by the author Courtney Maum, and I'm going to type this into the chat window, Before and After the Book Deal by Courtney Maum. And it's just, I remember when she was doing this project, she just went on Facebook and asked for tips from writers. And she sort of collected so it's not just her opinion. She basically got published authors to share info about what do you wish you knew before the book deal and after the book deal. So it's sort of a comprehensive look at all the little things that can occur during the process of leading up to a publication after the book comes out and you have to do some marketing. So it does cover marketing stuff, but it's not a pure marketing book. Really more than, I think the thing you want to worry about more than the marketing is all that publication stuff. There's so many little tiny moving pieces going on. And if you have some understanding, it's a little easier to navigate. All right, let's see what time we have. We have time for a couple more questions here. So if anyone else has a question, please type it in the chat. And I have a question of my own right now, in case no one else has any. So I was interested in the tone of the book, just from a craft perspective, because I think it really succeeds because it balances a very open, approachable tone. It's very easy to read this book. It's good, readable prose the entire time, but there are very tough, painful, traumatic happenings. And there's never this crossover to being like cloyingly sentimental or heavy-handed in dealing with some of the tougher subjects. It remains it's moving, but it's also just very readable and understandable, and I could follow it constantly. So where does tone originate for you? Is it there in the first draft? Did this book sound like this book in the first draft, or was it something that you really worked toward through successive revisions, and some of those that you maybe the first draft that doesn't exist anymore sounded completely different than this one?
Yeah, I think it existed in some of the existing stories that I had written and posted and blogged, and the ones that, if they were meaningful to me, they touched me, and I had found the right tone, and I think in that respect I had a sense. Now, clearly in the writing process, there were some that were off, and I had to go back and revise and make sure consistently the tone was consistent throughout. But for me, I would say that, at least for me, this was easy because I was so familiar with the content. These experiences had happened to me. And when I'm writing about things that had happened to me, I'm very matter of fact, very clear-eyed, very to the point, my emotions about them are measured, like not overly dramatic, because that's that's how I process them. And so that was, I think, what came out is because I was just so familiar with the content, and that's how I've approached these things that have happened to me. And but I do think you absolutely have to have tone in mind when you're writing, and figure out, like, is this going to be an approachable tone for somebody who reads it, given what the content is. And I think if I had over-indexed in a different way because the events were so heavy and dark, it would have turned folks off.
Great. Another question from the chat. Did you have readers prior to publishing? And I might add to that, readers prior to querying agents to publishing individual pieces of this?
Yeah, it was, so both, yes. So in the writing process, I had some readers, some beta readers. I actually worked with somebody, she is a book doula. I was like, that's a thing, right? She was great. And when I was particularly struggling with something in the book, I worked with her, and she really helped me unpack some insights. Like, she wasn't in like, edit this, edit this, edit this. She's like, I feel like you need to expand, like something's missing here, or you need to drill deeper here, or your pacing is off. So I had some beta readers. And then because I used an academic press, the University of Georgia Press. Many academic presses require, as part of their submission process, that they will send it out for review to authors and academics who are experts in your genre. And they send those back with notes and with a recommendation whether to publish or non-publish, and with encouragement to take their feedback, really take it to heart as you think about whether or not to make revisions.
Great. Well, I think we're about at the end of our hour here. So I want to move to the last question we like to ask all our guests, which is, what's one piece of advice you'd offer to a writer just starting out?
I would say, I go back to where I begin about the pressure that you put yourself. I'm going to write a book. You don't know what you're going to write, right? I'm going to write in this genre. Well, generally, but you might discover something along the way, like, you know what? This is a piece of short fiction, and not, and not sort of a memoir. Like, I'd rather retell it. I'd rather be able to have artistic license here and tell this using characters and create separation. It's going to be these many chapters. I'm going to publish this in a year. I'm going to finish it in 2 years. Along the way, what I always told myself is, it's going to be harder than you think, and it's going to take longer than you think. And I just continued to tell myself that. The only advice that I kept giving to myself is, just keep moving ahead, right? You will get there. Don't have an imaginary date or an imaginary length or an imaginary form or an imaginary publishing house in mind. Just focus on moving ahead and writing and making it the best possible product. Please yourself first before you worry about pleasing anyone else.
I think that's great advice and great advice to end on. Everyone, please pick up a copy of Steve Major's Hi, Yella. It's an outstanding memoir. I was so pleased to read it myself. I've been just as pleased to talk about it. So Steve, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great evening. I hope everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did.
Great. Terrific. Thank you, Zach, and to everyone at the Writers Center. Really appreciate it, and everyone in the audience. Have a great evening.